It was a Sunday like any other, or at least it started that way. I had spent the morning peeling apples and cinnamon sticks for a pie, something my own mother used to make, when the leaves turned, and the air carried that faint trace of nostalgia. I suppose I still believed in the ritual of comfort, even when no one else seemed to notice. I set the pie on the counter, to cool, hoping that the smell might stir a little warmth in the house. But when dinner came, they didn't wait for me. I heard forks hitting plates, chairs, scraping on the floor, laughter that didn't pause to check if I was coming. And when I finally shuffled in with a smile stretched too wide, trying to offer the pie, my daughter-in-law didn't even look up. "Oh, we already ate," she said, as if that explained everything, as if I hadn't cooked most of that meal. I stood there holding a knife in my hand, not in anger, just awkwardly because I didn't know where to put it now. My son said nothing. He didn't even meet my eyes. It was like I was a shadow in my own home, a ghost that wandered in and out of rooms but never belonged anywhere. I had helped them buy this house. When he and his wife were younger, struggling to qualify for a mortgage, I drained part of my retirement savings without blinking. "It's your family," I told myself back then. "You're investing in love." But that night I realized I hadn't invested in love. I'd subsidized my own erasure. The pie sat untouched, and I watched as they cleared their plates. They talked about renovations, how they wanted to knock down the wall between the living room and the den, how they'd turn that space into something more modern. "And maybe we could finally get rid of that old cabinet," she said, her voice slicing through the air like a clean, sharp blade. That cabinet had been mine. My husband built it before he died. But no one remembered that, or cared to ask. I sat alone in the kitchen after they left the table. No one said goodnight. No one thanked me. I wrapped the pie in foil and placed it in the fridge, not because I thought anyone would eat it, but because something about discarding it felt like discarding myself. It wasn't the first time I'd felt like an intruder in this home, but that night was the first time I understood what that really meant. I had been invited only so long as I stayed small, silent, and useful. I wasn't a guest. I was a fixture expected to stay out of the way unless needed. The silence after they went to bed wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. I sat on the couch for hours, hands folded in my lap, eyes on nothing in particular. I remembered my son's childhood laughter, the way he used to ask for my stories before bed. I remembered holding him during storms. How did it come to this? At what point did I go from being the center of his world to a background hum easy to mute? I thought about speaking up, about asking why, about saying, "Do you know how this feels?" But I already knew the answer. They'd sigh. They'd say I was being dramatic, sensitive, that it wasn't personal. But it was. It was as personal as an unspoken goodbye. That night I wrote in my journal for the first time in months. I didn't write much, just 3 sentences. "I am not wanted here. I am tolerated at best. And one day I will stop waiting to be loved." I didn't cry. Not that night. The tears had dried up over the years slowly like an old well that had been drawn from too many times without being replenished. What I felt instead was something quieter and heavier, a kind of stillness that wasn't peace, it was resignation. I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to my room. I paused outside their bedroom door, not to eavesdrop, but just to hear a trace of life, something that might remind me I was part of this family. I heard laughter, not the warm kind, the mocking kind, her voice shrill and amused, his low and compliant, and I turned away. I lay in bed that night with the kind of clarity that comes only when all distractions have been stripped away. They didn't see me. Not really. I was a relic, a placeholder, and perhaps worst of all, I had allowed it. But things were beginning to shift. I didn't know it then, but that silence I sat in wasn't just absence. It was the space where something new would begin to grow. The morning of my birthday came with no fanfare, no card slid under the door, no breakfast tray with toast or even tea, just the same brittle quiet, the same polite footsteps moving past my room as if the day were any other. For a moment I wondered if I had the date wrong. I reached for the small calendar on my nightstand, the one with faded flowers and handwritten notes from years past. No, I was right. It was the 18th, my birthday, 73. I got up anyway, pulled on my thick cardigan, the one with the fraying cuffs, and went downstairs. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast and scrambled eggs, but none of it had been made for me. My daughter-in-law was scrolling on her phone while sipping from a travel mug. She looked up when I entered, but didn't say anything. Not even a nod. My son was pulling on his coat, grumbling about traffic. When he saw me, he offered a quick, distracted smile. "Morning, Ma," he said, already halfway out the door. I waited, just a second longer. I stood there hoping ridiculously, I admit, that something was waiting in the car. Maybe he had hidden it. Maybe there was a plan, something. But the door shut, the car started, and they were gone. I poured myself a cup of lukewarm coffee, already bitter from sitting too long on the burner. The house was empty now, and I stood in the middle of it, the silence roaring louder than any party could. No balloons, no cake, no happy birthday, Mom. I thought of the birthdays I had given them, hand-sewn costumes, scavenger hunts in the backyard, candles on cupcakes I stayed up late, to frost voices singing off-key but joyfully. How easily that joy had slipped away from them, or maybe just from me. The house felt cavernous that day. I wandered from room to room, touching little things that used to belong to me. A lamp in the corner I bought at a flea market 40 years ago. A photo on the shelf that had been cropped just enough to cut me out. I was erasing pixel by pixel from the story of this family. Around noon, a delivery truck pulled into the driveway. My heart skipped just for a moment. I opened the door before he could knock. "For the Smith residence," he asked, holding a large white box. I nodded, already feeling my fingers tremble. It was a gift from my daughter-in-law, a new espresso machine. I watched her name spelled out perfectly on the label, neat and centered. She had ordered it for herself. I thanked the driver anyway. I sat on the front step with that box beside me, the sun warming my knees. I thought about what it meant to be remembered and what it meant to be forgotten. There's no ceremony to it, no clear day where people stop loving you. It happens in inches. First they forget to ask what you want, then they forget to ask how you are, and then finally they forget you altogether. I went back inside and opened my little sewing basket. I'd been saving some scraps of soft blue fabric for something special. I had no pattern in mind, no clear purpose, just the need to create something. To remind myself I still could. The stitches were slow, my fingers stiff, but the motion grounded me. As the thread wove in and out, I found myself thinking not about what I'd lost, but what I might still reclaim. Around 4 in the afternoon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, then answered. It was a woman named Clara, a home nurse, she said, calling to schedule an introductory visit for my recent fall paperwork filed by the doctor after I slipped in the garden a few weeks ago. I had forgotten all about that referral. We agreed she'd come by Tuesday afternoon. I nearly said no. Something in me still wanted to believe I didn't need help, but another part of me, quieter, steadier, said yes, because something was changing. That night, I made myself a modest dinner, 1 boiled egg, a piece of toast, and some leftover vegetables. I set the table just for me, lit a candle even though it was small and plain. I sang happy birthday under my breath softly like a lullaby no one else needed to hear. When the flame flickered, I made no wish. I just breathed. They came home late, chatting loudly in the hallway. No one asked how my day was. No one noticed the candle. And I didn't tell them. I just stood at the sink, washing my plate slowly as the hot water ran over my hands, and my silence grew its own kind of strength. Later, as I lay in bed, I looked at the small gift I had made from that blue fabric, a simple cloth pouch with a drawstring. Nothing useful, nothing valuable, but it was something made by my own hands on a day no one else remembered. A small act of defiance, a soft act of self-love. Birthdays used to mean so much. Now they mean something else. Not celebration, perhaps, but clarity. They've always mistaken my silence for ignorance, as if age peels away your intelligence, the way paint flakes off an old wall, as if having slower joints means you can't listen, as if pausing before speaking is the same as having nothing to say. I suppose it's easier for them to believe I don't understand because then they don't have to feel guilty when they speak, like I'm not even in the room. It was late one evening, a Thursday, I think. I had gone to bed early or so, they thought, but sleep didn't come easily those nights, not with the heaviness that had begun to settle behind my ribs, like damp wool. So I got up, wrapped myself in a shawl, and stepped quietly down the stairs. The house was dark except for the living room where my son and his wife sat talking. Their voices carried through the half-open door. "She's been here too long," she said, her voice clipped and sharp. "We said it would be temporary, remember, just until she recovered." "She has nowhere else to go," he muttered, though not with conviction. "What do you want me to do, throw her out?" There was a pause. "I want you to grow a spine." I stopped halfway down the staircase, heart pounding in my ears. "She doesn't pay rent. She doesn't help with anything anymore. She just floats, sits around and watches everything." "That's not fair," he said, though softer now. She scoffed. "And the kids avoid her. You know they do. She just sits there like some statue, always judging, always listening." My chest tightened. I turned and crept back up the stairs, each step a reminder of just how far I had fallen in their eyes. Judging, I hadn't said a word. But I suppose silence unnerves those with something to hide. Back in bed, I stared at the ceiling. The house was no longer a home. It was a holding pen. I was tolerated, not wanted. Cared for in the technical sense, fed, housed, but not loved. There is a difference, and anyone who's lived long enough can feel it in their bones. They assumed I didn't hear them. They assumed I didn't know about the new accounts they were opening, how they were siphoning money from the joint fund I had helped create. They didn't know I still had access, that I still read, still remembered. They talked openly in front of me now, discussing renovations, debts, vacations, as if I weren't there, as if I had melted into the wallpaper. I listened always silently. I noted what they bought, what they neglected, how they smiled at guests and frowned once the door was shut. I saw the masks slip, and I memorized every expression. They thought I was old and harmless, but old doesn't mean empty. Harmless doesn't mean helpless. There was one afternoon when I was folding laundry, my own, no one else's anymore, and I overheard them again. This time, about a trip. "She won't need us," my daughter-in-law said. "Let's just tell the nurse to check in a few times." "I don't know if we should leave her alone," my son said. "She'll be fine," she snapped. "It's not like she even talks." That phrase stuck in me like a thorn. It's not like she even talks. And maybe I didn't. Not to them. Not about the things that mattered. But inside me there was a roaring storm of words I had been too tired, too weary, too heartbroken to release. But now slowly I could feel the wind rising again. I started writing more. Not long letters, just notes, observations, memories, things I was beginning to prepare not for confrontation, but for clarity. I wanted my story in order. I wanted the truth known even if I never said it out loud, even if it only lived in paper tucked in a drawer where someone might find it one day and realize what they'd missed. The world thinks silence is weakness, but silence is also armor. It's the space in which a plan can bloom slow and careful like spring from frost. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I needed only to wait. I began saving receipts. I began moving small sums, nothing dramatic, just enough to reclaim pieces of my autonomy. I paid attention to names, lawyers, doctors, care, managers. I listened when the nurse came. I learned what my rights were, what their obligations were. I began to build the scaffolding of my next life, quietly brick by brick, with no announcement. They kept laughing, talking, assuming I was deaf to the world, but I wasn't. I was wide awake, listening with the precision only a mother, a widow, a woman long dismissed can manage. They didn't see it, but I was no longer waiting for love. I was planning for freedom. And in that silence I was gathering power. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, just as the light was beginning to soften across the hallway floor, the way it does when day quietly begins to surrender. I remember the sound of her shoes' rubber soles, no sharp clicks, just a gentle rhythm like a lullaby. Her name was Clara. She smiled with her whole face, not just the mouth, and that alone startled me. I hadn't been looked at with warmth in a very long time. "Hi, I'm here for Mrs. Allen," she said, peering gently past the door frame, and for a moment, I didn't even answer. I just stared at her, blinking, because hearing my name spoken softly, not barked or sighed, felt like sunlight on skin I'd forgotten to warm. I invited her in. We sat at the table and she began asking the usual questions. How had the fall happened? How was my mobility now? What medications I was on? But her tone wasn't clinical. It was curious, interested, human. And that, more than anything, undid me a little. I answered her honestly, told her about the garden hose I had tripped over, how the bruises still ached at night, how the stairs were becoming more of a challenge than I let on. She listened, really listened. Not like someone checking off a list, but like someone pulling threads together into a story she wanted to understand. After her assessment, she offered to help me back upstairs. I hesitated, embarrassed by how slow I was, but she didn't rush me. She didn't sigh. She just waited one step at a time, hand lightly on my elbow like a soft tether. When we reached the landing, I found myself apologizing, not sure why, just a reflex. "Sorry for taking so long," I murmured. Clara shook her head. "You don't need to apologize for being careful," she said. "You're allowed to take your time." That sentence lingered with me long after she left. You're allowed to take your time. When was the last time someone gave me that time? Patience. Permission to move at my own pace. Over the following weeks, Clara came regularly. Sometimes for check-ins, sometimes just to help with stretches or monitor my progress. But she always stayed a few minutes longer than she needed to. She asked questions that had nothing to do with charts about my childhood, my favorite books, whether I liked music while cooking. And then she did the unthinkable. She remembered my answers. She brought me ginger tea one day because I had mentioned I used to make it when I had joint pain. Another time she noticed I had a worn-out bookmark and brought me a new one hand-sewn from a little piece of embroidery. "Reminded me of you," she said with a smile. And just like that, without ceremony, someone saw me again. It's strange, the things that begin to heal us. Not grand gestures, not apologies. Sometimes it's a cup of tea placed just right, a pair of eyes that linger on your face, not because they're judging it, but because they care about what it holds. That's what Clara gave me. Not pity, not charity attention. She asked once if I was happy here. It was a simple question asked while we were folding towels together. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the towel in my hand, feeling the frayed edge between my fingers. I used to be, I said finally. But I think I've forgotten what that feels like. She didn't press. She didn't offer a solution. She just nodded and folded another towel, the silence between us warm rather than cold. Later that week, I overheard my daughter-in-law mocking Clara to her friend on the phone. She's too soft, always talking to her like they're best friends. Honestly, it's a little much. But I smiled, because I had heard the jealousy in her voice, not of Clara's job, but of her spirit, of the ease with which she gave what others withheld. One evening, it was raining. The family had gone out to dinner and forgot to tell me, or perhaps didn't care if I joined. I sat by the window watching the drops stream down the glass, like tiny rivers, feeling that old ache rise again. But then my phone buzzed. It was a text from Clara. "Thinking of you tonight. Don't forget your tea." That simple line broke something open in me. I stood up, made the tea, and held it close. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel invisible. Clara didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. She was no longer just a nurse to me. She was something deeper, a witness, a balm, a reminder that I hadn't imagined the way love used to feel. And quietly I began to wonder, what if family wasn't just who you were given, but who showed up when no one else did? It was supposed to be a short walk, just a few minutes in the backyard, some fresh air, before the afternoon turned to dusk. I had wrapped myself in a shawl, one I'd knitted years ago, when my hands were steadier, and shuffled out onto the patio with my cane and a light heart. The garden looked tired, as gardens do in late autumn dry leaves, scattered like old thoughts, the trees bare waiting. But the cool breeze felt good against my cheeks, and for once I didn't feel quite so weighed down. I sat in the wooden chair near the flower beds where my husband and I used to sip tea in quieter times. I closed my eyes and let the wind speak. I didn't realize how long I'd sat there until the sky had shifted from gray to deeper blue, and the air had turned sharp. I tried to stand. My legs resisted. My knee throbbed from an old injury that never quite healed, and I realized with a quiet sort of fear that I couldn't get up on my own. I turned to call for help softly at first, then louder, but the door was closed. The lights inside were on. I could see their silhouettes, my son's tall frame moving from room to room, her pacing with a phone pressed to her ear, but no one looked out. I called again. Nothing. The wind picked up, threading through the fibers of my shawl like tiny cold fingers. I hugged it tighter around me, trying to hold on to warmth, to patience, to hope that someone would remember I existed. I thought, surely they'll realize. Surely someone will wonder where I went. But minutes passed, then more. I stopped calling. My throat was tight, my lips dry. The silence outside was louder than any shout. And then I heard a car door slamming. Laughter. They were leaving. I watched them through the slats of the patio railing as they got into the car dressed for dinner perfume, trailing in the wind like a slap. My son didn't even glance toward the backyard. The car reversed headlights sweeping over me for a fleeting second, and then they were gone. The cold settled in like an accusation. I sat frozen not just by weather, but by realization. I wasn't an afterthought. I was no thought at all. I don't know how long I sat there. Time softened at the edges. The light dimmed until everything was a hazy blue-gray. My hands ached. My shoulders curled forward like wilted petals. And then headlights appeared again, but not from the driveway, from the street. The engine turned off. I heard a door open. Footsteps, quick, familiar, firm. Mrs. Allen, Clara. She rushed toward me, a shadow of urgency in her voice I hadn't heard before. Her arms wrapped around me as she helped me to my feet, brushing the hair from my damp forehead. "What are you doing out here? It's freezing." I just came out for air," I said, teeth chattering now, breath fogging between us. "They forgot." She didn't finish the thought. She just held my elbow and guided me inside. Her hands, those gentle hands, were warm against my skin like fire from a hearth. She made tea without asking, sat with me in the kitchen, both of us wrapped in wool and quiet understanding. "They left for dinner," I said, after a while, more to the room than to her. Clara nodded. I figured. "I came by to drop off some papers, but something told me to check the back." That sentence pressed itself deep into me. Something told me to check the back. I stared at her as she added a touch of honey to my tea. "You didn't have to stop." She met my eyes. "I know." And that was it. That was everything. I don't know if she ever told them what happened that night. They didn't mention it. When they came back later, laughing and tipsy, no one asked where I'd been. No one asked how I was. I could have been gone for all they knew, or cared. But Clara knew. She started stopping by more often, not always for professional reasons, sometimes with cookies, or a new tea she thought I'd like, sometimes just to sit. I didn't ask questions, I just let her be there. One afternoon, she helped me sort through some boxes in the attic. Old photographs, dresses I hadn't worn in decades, letters from my husband tied in yellowed string. She held them gently, with the reverence of someone who knew memory wasn't junk. "You kept all this," she whispered once, holding a picture of me in my 20s, laughing at a beach I could no longer name. "I was someone once," I said quietly. Before they decided, I was no one. Clara looked at me not with pity, but with something I couldn't yet name. Respect, perhaps, or maybe recognition. After that night in the cold, I began to realize that sometimes being left outside is a blessing in disguise. You learn who will come looking for you. You learn who brings the warmth. And more importantly, you learn that some doors are better left closed behind you. It was such a small moment, so soft, so subtle, that if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have missed it. But by then I had learned to listen closely, to the silences, to the spaces between words, to the tone of voice when someone says something that means more than it should. Clara was helping me fold laundry. It had become our routine shared cups of tea, long talks, and small tasks done together without hurry. That afternoon, the sunlight filtered through the window in long golden stripes across the kitchen table. The warmth was gentle, not just in temperature, but in feeling, the kind of warmth I hadn't felt inside these walls in years. I was folding towels the way I always had, edges aligned just so. Clara held one up slightly crooked and laughed. "You're going to turn me into a proper housewife, you know," that she teased. I smiled. But it faded quickly. I didn't feel like anyone's teacher anymore. My own family treated me like an obligation, not a legacy. The skills I had once passed down with pride were now seen as outdated, quaint, unnecessary. But Clara cared. She watched, she asked, she tried. She remembered how I liked my tea, how I arranged my napkins, how I hummed under my breath when I was focused. At one point, she paused, holding up a perfectly folded towel. "Like this, right, Mother?" The word slipped out like a sigh, unplanned, unscripted. She froze. Her eyes widened. I didn't mean I'm sorry, that just slipped." I looked at her, and for a long moment we just stood there, the word hanging in the air like a bird afraid to land. But I didn't correct her. I didn't tell her not to say it. Instead, something warm moved through me, something I hadn't felt in years. It was like a bell inside my chest had rung for the first time in a long time, resonating through ribs that had grown used to silence. She looked embarrassed, ready to apologize again, but I stopped her with a quiet smile. "I didn't mind," I said, and I meant it. That one word, mother, meant more to me than all the mom and ma and mum I'd heard from my son in the last decade, because it came without expectation, without duty. It came from affection, not obligation. From then on, she never used it again, not out loud. But I felt it in the way she brought me soup when my knees flared up. I felt it in the way she waited to see if I needed help up the stairs, never rushing, never insisting. I felt it in the way she spoke to me, not around me, not at me, but to me. That night I pulled out an old photo album I hadn't touched in years. The pages were brittle, the corners curling with age. I stared at pictures of my younger self, tight-waisted dresses, red lipstick, a child on my hip, and another in the background, chasing a kite. I remembered being needed, not just for money or shelter, but for guidance, presence, safety. I closed the album and sat in the dark for a long while. Later that week, I asked Clara if she had family nearby. She shook her head. "No, it's just me. My mother passed a long time ago. It was never really close anyway." That explained something. The tenderness, the way she lingered even after her shift was over, the way she looked at me like I was something more than a task on a clipboard. She didn't say it, but I saw the hunger for connection mirrored in her as much as I felt it in myself. The irony wasn't lost on me that a stranger could offer more comfort than blood, that someone paid to be here would stay long after the job required. One evening, she brought a small box of pastries. "I tried baking," she said with a sheepish grin. "Be gentle." I laughed. I hadn't laughed like that in months, maybe years. "Let's see if I trained you well." We ate together, and for a brief moment, the kitchen felt alive, not with tension, not with cold stares or silent disapproval, but with warmth, with shared presence, with family, or at least something close enough to believe in again. After she left that night, I sat by the window for a long time, watching the street lamps flicker on one by one. I realized I had stopped feeling lonely when she was around. I realized I waited for her visits the way I used to wait for my son to come home from school. I realized that love doesn't always arrive in the form you expect. Sometimes it comes wearing scrubs, carrying tea-folding towels, calling you mother without meaning to, but meaning it all the same. And for the first time in a long time, I let the hope back in. It happened in the kitchen where so much had happened over the years, both the joyful and the quietly brutal. I was rinsing vegetables under the faucet. Clara not yet arrived when my son walked in with that familiar look of irritation, already tightening his jaw. I recognized it. That expression meant he'd been waiting for the smallest excuse to unload something, and I, it seemed, had become the perfect outlet. He glanced at the counter, then at me. "Did you use the olive oil again?" he asked, accusing more than asking. "I used a spoonful. I thought it was for everyone," I replied, keeping my voice level. He let out a scoff, loud and performative. "That stuff's expensive, Ma. You don't need to cook your own meals. We've got food delivery now." "I prefer making my own," I said gently. "It keeps my hands busy." "You're in our kitchen," he snapped. "Sometimes it feels like you don't even think about how this house runs." I froze, water still running over my hands. His words weren't just frustration. They were coded, "You are a burden. You don't belong. You're in the way." He leaned against the counter and exhaled like he was carrying the weight of the world. "Look, I don't want to fight, but maybe you should stay quiet about things you don't understand, about how we manage our home, about your nurse, about what we do with our money." My heart lurched. "Excuse me? You keep making little comments, asking Clara things, digging. It's not your place anymore. Not your place anymore. That phrase hit me harder than I expected. My place. I had changed his diapers in this place, fed him soup when he was sick, held him during night terrors. My fingerprints were on every cabinet door and picture frame. My money had paid for the roof, and now I was being told to stay quiet, like a child, like an inconvenience. He turned away, already done with the conversation. It's just easier when things are calm, he muttered. And you've been stirred up lately. Because I'm finally speaking, I asked quieter now, but clearer. Because I asked questions, not shouted, not accused, just asked. He didn't answer, just walked out of the room, leaving me with the sound of my own breath and the slow drip of the faucet. I stood there for a long time. My hands began to shake, not from fear, but from restraint. Every cell in me wanted to shout to tell him how small he had made me feel, how long I'd swallowed my own dignity to keep the peace. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I dried my hands and sat at the kitchen table, the one I had once lacquered myself with 3 coats of varnish, so the boys couldn't scratch it during homework. I pulled out a small notepad from the drawer and wrote something I hadn't allowed myself to write before. If I don't speak now, I'll disappear. That afternoon, Clara arrived as usual, and I didn't mention the conversation. Not directly, but I watched her more closely, her kindness, her care, the quiet gravity of her presence, and I began to feel something new forming beneath the ache resolve. Later that evening, I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom. The reflection met me with lines carved deep by years of worry, of work, of waiting, but also with something else, something firm, something intact. I wasn't just someone's mother, someone's burden. I was a woman who had built a life from nothing, and no one could erase that. The next day, I called my lawyer. It wasn't a dramatic call. I didn't scream or sob, I just asked questions. Careful ones, about power of attorney, about rights, about legal options for changing next of kin, about adopting another adult should the heart and the law make room for it. The man on the other end didn't judge, he simply answered. And when I hung up the phone, I realized that silence had never protected me. It had only imprisoned me. And now finally I had found the key. They wanted quiet. But quiet wasn't peace. Quiet was a muzzle, and I had worn it long enough. From that day on, I began to speak again, not loudly, not bitterly, but clearly, to Clara, to the mirror, to myself. He had said I should stay quiet, but I had finally remembered that my voice belonged to me. I spent the next week going through drawers I hadn't opened in years, folders yellowed with time, envelopes, with brittle glue papers I had once guarded like treasure, and then gradually forgotten. My hands, though slower now, still knew the rhythm of careful searching. I laid each document out across the bed, like a quilt of memory. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, the deed to a car that no longer existed, the will I had signed years ago when love still felt unconditional. There was something sobering about seeing your life reduced to ink and signatures, proof of who you are, but never the whole story. No certificate could show the hours I sat beside a sick child, the meals I cooked when money was thin, the sacrifices folded into every corner of my adulthood. But still, these papers mattered now, because I was changing the ending. I called the lawyer again. We spoke at length. I told him I was considering a change in beneficiaries, possibly an adoption. He didn't react, just listened, asked thoughtful questions. "Is there a reason you're doing this now?" he asked gently. I paused, then answered with something I hadn't even realized was true until I said it aloud, because I no longer believe blood is the same as loyalty. He nodded. That's reason enough. He walked me through what I would need. I'd need identification, a revised will, a notarized petition. I'd need to explain the nature of the relationship if I wanted to adopt Clara as my legal daughter. That last part, he said carefully, would be scrutinized. Some may think it's vindictive, he added, that you're doing it to spite your son. I'm not, I said. I'm doing it because I finally learned the difference between being looked after and being seen. We set a tentative date for the will signing. I marked it in the back of my calendar in soft pencil, as if afraid to make it real just yet. That evening, I opened an old shoebox I kept in the closet, one of the few things I hadn't thrown away when I moved into my son's house. Inside were letters, dozens of them. My husband's handwriting looping and uneven but full of soul. Letters from his deployment letters from the hospital when he knew he was fading, and one final envelope I had never opened. It was addressed to me, my name in careful script. I had tucked it away the night of his funeral and couldn't bear to read it then. I wasn't ready to hear goodbye. But now something told me it was time. I unfolded the letter, my fingers trembling, and read, "My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But if I know you, you've held on to this letter like a stubborn promise. Don't be afraid to choose yourself. You gave your life to this family, every moment, every breath. But love isn't meant to drain you. It's meant to fill you. If they ever make you feel small, remember you were the lighthouse, not the storm. You deserve peace, even if you have to build it alone. Always, James." I cried, not because I was sad, but because for the first time in so long I felt seen. Even from the grave, James knew. He'd always known. When Clara arrived the next morning, I was quieter than usual. She noticed, of course. She always noticed. "Are you all right?" she asked, setting down her bag. I nodded. Then I looked at her carefully, as if seeing her not just as she was, but as she might become. "I have a strange question," I said, "but it's coming from a place of love, not desperation." She tilted her head. "Okay. If you could choose your family, would you?" She blinked. "I think I already have, in a way." I smiled then. Not a big smile, just a small knowing one. I didn't ask her right away, but I knew in that moment the seed had been planted, and soon it would grow. I continued my paperwork in secret. No one knew. Not my son, not his wife. I let them think I was wilting while I was in fact writing the next chapter. I organized my assets, transferred what I could. I prepared a new will. My attorney handled everything with discreet professionalism. And still I said nothing. Because silence, I had learned, was not just the absence of noise. It could also be a container, a space where transformation brews. They didn't hear the click of the locks I changed on my accounts. They didn't see the documents filed in quiet offices, witnessed by quiet strangers. They didn't feel the shift in me. But it was happening. In the quiet, I was becoming powerful again. It was after dinner on a Thursday when I finally asked. The house was unusually quiet. My son and his wife had gone out to a friend's gathering, not bothering to invite me, of course. Clara had stayed later than usual that evening, helping me organize the linen closet. We were sitting in the living room, a cup of chamomile in each of our hands, the air between us filled with the kind of stillness that doesn't ask to be filled. She had taken off her shoes, tucked her feet beneath her on the armchair, and we were talking about nothing and everything old music. Her favorite childhood book, The Garden I Used to Tend, back when my knees were stronger. I watched her for a while as she spoke. Her voice had that calming rhythm, soft at the edges measured. But there was something beneath it, something carefully protected. That kind of pain you only recognize when you've lived long enough to see it in the mirror. I don't know what made me ask then, but I leaned forward gently, setting my cup down. My voice came quieter than I meant it to, but she heard. "Clara, did you ever wish for a mother?" She stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes didn't widen, but something inside them pulled back as if startled. She didn't answer right away. She just looked down at her tea, turning the cup slowly in her hands. I waited. After a long pause, she spoke so softly I almost missed it. "I did, but I stopped hoping for that a long time ago." There was a sadness in her tone, but also a resolve. The kind of strength born from too many disappointments. The kind of strength I knew too well. I think she added, "I just stopped expecting someone to care without wanting something in return." My chest tightened, because I knew that wound. I had lived inside that wound for years. I reached across the table and placed my hand on hers, not as a gesture of comfort, but as an acknowledgement. Two women, both overlooked, both forgotten in different ways, suddenly standing in the same quiet truth. "I don't want anything in return," I said. "That's not why I asked." She looked at me then fully. No mask, no deflection, just the raw vulnerability of someone waiting for the ground to fall out beneath them. But it didn't. It held. We held. From that moment, something shifted between us, not dramatically, not with big words or declarations, but subtly, like two lines finally intersecting after running parallel for so long. The next morning, I found her in the kitchen, humming softly, preparing breakfast, even though it wasn't in her job description. She set a plate in front of me, 2 eggs toast with the edges trimmed, a slice of orange arranged like a sunrise. The kind of breakfast a mother might make for a child. "You didn't have to do this," I said. "I know," she replied. She never answered my question directly, but she didn't have to. Her silence was thick with meaning, not avoidance. And when I referred to her later as my Clara to a neighbor on the phone, she smiled, not correcting me. I began to see it everywhere, in the way she checked on me, even on her days off, in the way she kept track of my favorite cardigan when it went missing, in the way she touched my shoulder when I looked distant. And I responded not with grand gestures, but with small acts of trust, letting her comb my hair one morning, letting her see the worn photograph of my wedding day, letting her sit with me while I cried, without needing to explain why. One day I showed her the pouch I had sewn on my birthday. She held it in her hands like it was something precious, not just a bit of fabric and thread. "You made this?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "It's not much." She looked at me. "It's everything." That was the moment I knew. She didn't need to be born to me to belong to me. Later that evening, I pulled out the new will from my drawer. I didn't show her, not yet, but I placed it on the desk, weighed it down with a small porcelain bird my husband once gave me, and left the drawer slightly open. I wasn't hiding it. I was just waiting for the right time, not because I feared regret, but because I wanted the moment to be about love, not legality. I thought of the question I had asked her and how her silence had spoken the answer I needed. She had wanted a mother, and now perhaps she had one. And me, I had a daughter, not by blood, not by history, but by choice. And that kind of family, the kind you choose with intention, with tenderness, with reverence, is sometimes the only kind that lasts. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when I returned to the lawyer's office. The sky was gray, not with menace, but with a soft kind of heaviness, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for me to exhale first. I wore my best coat, the deep blue one with the velvet trim I used to save for church. My steps were slow but certain. Clara offered to drive me, but I declined. Some things I needed to do on my own. The receptionist greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She had the face of someone used to grief, to family drama, to long sighs in waiting rooms. But I didn't bring any of that with me. I wasn't there to mourn. I was there to decide. Mr. Talbot the lawyer was respectful as always. He laid the papers out on the table one by one. The new will, the amendment to the old, a durable power of attorney, a declaration of intent for adult adoption, all lined up like the pages of my second life. "Are you sure?" he asked me once more. I nodded. I've never been more sure of anything. He handed me the pen, heavy gold-tipped, a little too ornate, the kind of pen meant for contracts and vows. I took it in my hand and felt its weight not just in my fingers but in my chest. And then I began to write. I crossed out my son's name, gently, slowly, not out of rage but out of truth. It felt like removing a name from a dinner table where the guest no longer showed up, not because he died, but because he disappeared in plain sight. In the space beneath, I wrote hers, Clara. Her name in ink looked right. It looked true. Mr. Talbot didn't comment. He just notarized the documents with the practiced ease of someone who has seen love take many forms and watched as it reclaimed itself from the edges of betrayal. When it was done, I sat back in the leather chair and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years, not just months, years. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about acknowledgement, about honoring the woman who had sat with me in silence, who had brought light into a house that had gone cold, who had seen me, not as an obligation, but as a person still full of stories, humor, grace. I thought back to all the things my son had said, or worse, had never said. All the birthdays he forgot, the phone calls he skipped, the sharp tone he used when no one was watching. It wasn't one moment. It was hundreds, and I had excused every single one until they became the fabric of our relationship. But I was no longer sewing excuses. I was cutting ties. I took a copy of the will with me when I left, slipped it into my bag between a novel I never finished and a bag of sugar cookies Clara had baked the night before. I smiled at the contrast cookies and closure. At home, I didn't say anything that day. I waited. That evening, my son passed me in the hallway, barely nodding. My daughter-in-law didn't look up from her laptop. Life continued as though nothing had shifted, and perhaps for them it hadn't. But I knew better. Later that night, Clara came by to drop off some supplies. I invited her to sit, made her tea. There was a silence between us, not awkward, just filled with something neither of us quite knew how to say. I reached into the drawer and placed a single folded document on the table between us. She looked at it. "What's this?" I took a breath. "It's my will, my new one." She hesitated. "You didn't have to." "I did," I interrupted softly, "because you're the one who's been here. You're the one who listened. You're the one who reminded me who I am. That's not something I can ignore." She blinked quickly, trying to hold back tears she wasn't prepared to release. "I don't want to be a burden to anyone anymore," I said. "I want to be a gift, and you've made me feel like I still am one." She didn't say anything, just reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her grip firm, warm, unafraid. I didn't need a parade. I didn't need a family dinner. All I needed was that moment, that hand in mine, that quiet agreement between two women who had found each other in a world that so often forgets what women like us are worth. The ink was dry, the decision made, and for the first time in years, I felt free. Not from them, but from me. It's strange how people only notice your presence when you withdraw it. Not your body, your energy, your attention, your quiet gestures that had been so easily dismissed. They'd stopped seeing them as gestures at all. And so when I stopped, they noticed. Not right away, but gradually, like a room slowly losing heat. I no longer greeted them at the door. I no longer made their favorite meals just because. I didn't leave folded laundry in neat piles outside their bedroom, or refill the pantry, with the snacks they liked. I stopped asking how their day was. I stopped offering rides, reminders, comforts. I simply became still. At first they didn't react. My daughter-in-law seemed pleased not to see me hovering in the kitchen. My son barely noticed I wasn't watching the kids or adjusting the thermostat to his liking. But after a few days, the silence began to stretch. It filled the spaces between them, and then it became uncomfortable. One morning, she knocked on my bedroom door. "Are you okay?" she asked, voice tight with something that wasn't concern, more like suspicion. "I'm fine," I answered simply. She hesitated, waiting for more. I gave her none. That afternoon, I made myself tea and drank it outside alone. No one joined me. No one asked if I wanted company. I think they were waiting for me to revert to step back into the role they had grown comfortable with, the silent helper, the self-erasing matriarch. But that woman no longer lived here. One evening, my son came into the living room while I was reading. He lingered in the doorway like a boy who had forgotten why he entered the room. "You've been quiet lately," he said. I looked up at him over my reading glasses. "You asked me to be." He shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean completely." "Then you should have been clearer." He didn't know what to say. I returned to my book. The next day, they held a conversation at the kitchen island that was louder than usual, deliberate in its volume, about the finances, about the mortgage, about the importance of understanding how things would be handled someday. I heard my name once or twice, mumbled under breath, coded in passive aggression. I didn't interrupt. I stirred my tea and let the words pass over me like wind against an old tree. I had rooted myself deeper than they knew. Their assumptions no longer shook me. Then came the subtle invasions, him checking my drawer accidentally, her asking where I kept certain papers, hints disguised as casual questions. I met each one with a smile too calm to be challenged. Eventually, I took steps they couldn't ignore. I removed my name from the shared grocery account. I withdrew my monthly deposit into the house fund. I canceled the gardener who I had been paying quietly all this time. It didn't take long for things to fall out of order. The pantry ran low. The garden went untrimmed. The bills came in heavier than before. And still I said nothing. My son asked to speak with me one evening. We sat at the kitchen table. He folded his hands like a man about to negotiate. "We've noticed things shifting," he began. "And if something's bothering you—" "I'm not upset," I said, cutting gently but firmly. "I've simply chosen to reserve my energy for people who value it." He frowned. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" I asked. "Tell me, what part of me have you valued this past year, aside from what I could provide?" He looked away. "I gave without keeping score." "But that doesn't mean you didn't keep taking." I stood up, not in anger, but in completion. "I'm not punishing you," I said. "I'm freeing myself." And I meant it. After that, they began to tiptoe. She brought home a bouquet one day, store-bought cellophane still crinkling, and left it on the table without a word. I didn't touch it. He offered to drive me to my next doctor's appointment. I declined. Clara already had it handled. There's a kind of panic that sets in when people realize your silence isn't passive, it's intentional. They mistook my stillness for surrender, not knowing it was simply the beginning of my departure. Because I was already leaving emotionally, mentally, and soon legally. And that terrified them. But I didn't rush to make it dramatic. I let the silence teach them what my words never could, that I was no longer available to be their background noise, that I would no longer perform the role of the grateful burden. Some nights I sat in my room and wrote, not letters to them, letters to myself, promises of peace, of self-trust, of staying soft but no longer foolish. And when Clara came by, I smiled. I opened the door wider. I let her into my day, my space, my life. because she didn't need to be shown the difference between presence and performance. She already knew. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I just became quiet with purpose. And in that quiet, they finally heard me. It wasn't a grand event. There was no truck in the driveway, no boxes stacked head high, no furniture being carted through the door, just one duffel bag, a folded quilt, and a canvas tote, with books and a chipped teacup she insisted on keeping because it feels like it already belongs here. Clara moved in the way moonlight enters a dark room, gently without asking permission, illuminating things you didn't realize had grown dim. The decision had grown between us naturally, after weeks of longer visits of her staying past sunset, of our conversations deepening and quieting into something beyond duty. One day she arrived with a sigh in her breath and a bruise forming just below her collarbone. Her roommate had lost her temper again. Not violence, she insisted, just chaos, shouting, shoving things off counters, the kind of disruption that keeps you looking over your shoulder, even in your own home. She didn't ask for shelter. She only mentioned it in passing, the way people do when they're used to surviving without burdening anyone. But I saw it. I heard it in her pause. I saw it in the way her hand trembled slightly as she poured my tea. So I asked, "Why don't you stay here? The guest room's clean, and I'd feel better knowing someone is nearby." She blinked, startled. "Are you sure?" "Very." I didn't say it then, but I wanted her here, not just for safety, but for the light she brought, the sense of being witnessed, the way her laughter settled in corners of the house that had long stopped echoing. The silence had become sacred to me, yes, but only because she had made it so. She moved in on a Monday. That morning, my daughter-in-law saw Clara carry her duffel inside and shot me a look over her coffee. "Is she staying now?" I nodded. "For a while." "Where?" she asked. "In the guest room," I answered plainly. "The one that used to be mine, remember." She didn't reply, just turned away, her mug tight in her hand, her silence sharper than any comment she could have made. My son approached me later that night, his tone the carefully measured one he used when he was pretending not to be angry. "What's this about Clara moving in? You didn't ask us." "I didn't know I had to," I replied softly but without apology. "This is our house." "No," I said. "It's the house we bought. You may have forgotten the down payment I provided, but I haven't." He swallowed whatever he was about to say and walked off. I watched his retreating back and didn't feel the familiar ache of guilt that used to follow moments like this. Just clarity, a clean break forming without the need for splinters or screams. Clara's presence changed the rhythm of the house almost instantly. Her laughter in the kitchen, the scent of her herbal shampoo in the bathroom, the gentle hum of her music as she unpacked. She didn't take up space, she shared it like sunlight, pouring across a bare floor. She started cooking dinner a few nights a week. Nothing fancy, soups, stews, things she'd learned from her grandmother. We sat at the table and ate slowly, without needing to fill the silence. Sometimes we talked about old movies. Sometimes we said nothing at all. But there was comfort in that nothing, a warmth. Even the air felt different, softer, less strained. My daughter-in-law became increasingly irritable. Her voice sharpened around the edges, and she began slamming drawers, sighing loudly when she passed Clara in the hallway. My son avoided confrontation, but his glances lingered longer, tinged with resentment. He no longer bothered to hide. But Clara never reacted. She remained calm, unbothered, steady. That only seemed to enrage them more. One night, after Clara and I had spent the evening watching a documentary on migratory birds, something quiet and beautiful, my daughter-in-law cornered me in the hall. "She's replacing us," she hissed. "Do you not see what you're doing?" I looked at her for the first time, truly seeing the fear in her eyes. Not love lost, but control slipping, and I answered in the only way I knew how. No one can be replaced unless they step away. She had no response, and I went to bed with no regret. Clara and I began tending the garden again. She bought me seedlings. We dug our hands into the soil like it was prayer, life returning in slow, deliberate roots. She began calling this place home. Not loudly, not ceremonially, just once offhandedly. "I'll be home after the market," she said one day, gathering her bag. And I froze in the doorway. Home. It rang in me like a church bell. Because for the first time in years, I believed it too. I knew it would come. I had prepared for it not with armor or a speech, but with stillness. I had long since learned that the real strength wasn't in raising your voice, but in refusing to be moved by someone else's storm. And when the storm came, it arrived exactly as expected, loud, bitter, indignant. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. My son had found the new will. Not because I gave it to him, but because he was snooping, searching through the drawer in the study while pretending to look for stamps. I was upstairs folding linens with Clara when I heard the sharp crack of a file being tossed shut, then the hard thud of his footsteps coming up the stairs like thunder. He didn't knock. He just pushed the door open. "What the hell is this?" he barked, waving the will like a flag of betrayal. I turned slowly. Clara straightened beside me, quietly stepping aside, but staying in the room. I looked at the papers in his hand and said calmly, "It's exactly what it looks like." "You rewrote the will," he spat, eyes wide, voice rising. "You left everything to her." I did. His face turned red, a color I remembered from childhood tantrums. But this was not a child now. This was a grown man, angry not because he'd been wronged, but because his assumption of entitlement had been pierced. "She's not family," he shouted. "You barely know her." I didn't flinch, and yet she treats me with more care than you have in years. He opened his mouth to retort, but I continued, voice steady. "She listens. She shows up. She doesn't forget my birthday. She doesn't leave me freezing outside. She doesn't ask me to stay quiet." His mouth shut. I stepped closer. "And she doesn't come into my room waving documents like threats. So tell me who's more deserving of what I have left." For a moment he looked like he might scream, or cry, or both. But instead he crumpled the will slightly in his hand and stared at it, like it had betrayed him. "You're being manipulated," he said, quieter now, almost pleading. "She's taking advantage of you." "If that's true," I replied, "she's doing a much better job at it than you ever did." The silence that followed was long. Clara stood perfectly still, respectful, but unafraid. "I supported you," he said finally. "I let you live here." "No," I said. "I let you live here. My name is still on the deed, and every light you flip on every hot meal you eat has my fingerprints on it." He stared at me, wounded now, not in the heart, but in the ego. And after all that he said, "You're giving it all to a stranger." "She's not a stranger," I said. "She's family by choice, not by blood, but by bond." He didn't understand. He couldn't. To him, family had always been a ladder climb up when it served you step on others when you needed to. He had forgotten that real family is not something you inherit. It's something you earn. He left without another word, his shoulders rigid, his steps too quick, the door slamming just enough to remind me of his fury. But I didn't shake. I sat down at the edge of the bed, letting the moment settle like dust after a storm. Clara gently placed the will back into its folder and returned it to the drawer. "He'll come back," she said softly. "I know," I replied, "but this time I won't be waiting." We didn't speak much that evening, just shared a quiet meal. I think we both needed the stillness to wash the last of his rage from the walls. Later, I stepped into the garden and breathed deeply. The lavender we'd planted last month had started to bloom. Its scent reminded me of resilience, how something can survive frost and neglect and still rise to meet the sun. I thought about my son, about how hard it must be to lose something you never valued until it was gone. I felt a flicker of sorrow, but not regret. Because his rage, once the thing that kept me afraid, now felt small, ineffective, like a child trying to stop the tide with a shout. I didn't need his approval. I didn't need his permission. And most of all, I no longer needed his love to feel whole. The courthouse was colder than I expected, not just in temperature, but in feeling a kind of quiet sterility that tried to shrink everything down to black and white papers and wooden benches, stripping away the layers of emotion that had led us here. But Clara and I walked in together, side by side, her hand brushing lightly against mine, as if to ask, "Are you ready?" I was. I had been ready for a long time. The hearing wasn't for the will that was already handled. This was for the adoption, the formal legal recognition that Clara was no longer just a nurse or a house guest, but family. My family. My son had contested it, of course. Filed objections, claimed I was being manipulated, coerced, exploited. He painted Clara as an opportunist, and himself as the devoted child cast aside. But we had prepared. My lawyer had assembled years' worth of evidence calendars showing missed birthdays, financial records detailing my contributions, text messages that had gone unanswered for weeks, and most importantly, testimony mine. When they called my name, I stood up slowly, letting the quiet strength of my age speak louder than any cane or wrinkle ever could. I made my way to the witness chair, one step at a time, feeling the weight of the room but not its intimidation. I had lived through worse than cold stares and legal jargon. I had survived grief, neglect, and silence. This was just paperwork. They asked me why. Why, Clara? Why now? I looked out at the judge and then at Clara, who sat with her hands folded in her lap, trying to look composed, but with her eyes shining like glass just before it tips into tears. "I've spent most of my life giving," I said, "to my husband, to my children, to this world that often forgot I existed. And for a long time I believed that giving was enough, that one day the love I'd poured out would return to me." I paused, letting the silence settle, but it didn't. I turned slightly toward Clara. "Until her." The judge nodded, gesturing for me to continue. "She came into my life when I had stopped asking for anything, and instead of demanding, she listened. Instead of taking, she gave. Not in grand gestures, but in small, consistent kindnesses, the kind that build trust, brick by brick. She didn't ask to be family, but she acted like it long before I made the decision." The attorney for my son objected some procedural technicality, but the judge overruled. I continued. "My son is not here because he's afraid for me. He's here because he's afraid of what he's losing. But what he's trying to claim was never nurtured. And love, your honor, must be nurtured. It must be tended like a garden. And when it's not, it withers." I returned to my seat beside Clara and took her hand in mine. The judge looked over the documents, asked a few more formal questions, then took a moment before giving his decision. And in that pause, I felt the breath of my husband beside me, not physically but spiritually, as if he were standing behind me proud, whispering, "You're doing the right thing. You're giving yourself back to someone who truly sees you." And then it was done. With the bang of a gavel and the soft murmur of shuffled papers, Clara became my daughter in the eyes of the law. The courtroom didn't erupt into applause. There were no tears of joy from bystanders. My son left before the session ended, storming out with a furious look that didn't even graze me. Let him go. Let his anger follow him like a coat he refused to take off. We left hand in hand into the gray light of afternoon, the air smelling faintly of rain and pavement. We didn't speak at first. We just walked. Outside, I looked at her, really looked at her and said, "It's official now." She gave a teary laugh. "I don't need paper to call you my mother." "I know," I said, "but now the world knows too." That evening, back at the house, I lit a single candle and placed it on the table between us, not for celebration, but as a symbol, for all the nights I'd eaten alone, for all the years I'd given without thanks, for all the birthdays that went unnoticed. This flame, small and flickering, was for me. And she sat across from me, holding her mug with both hands like a prayer, and whispered, "Thank you for choosing me." But I shook my head. "No, Clara, thank you for seeing me, for reminding me I was still worth choosing." We ate dinner in peace. And when I looked out the window and saw the stars beginning to break through the clouds, I realized that I had found something I hadn't known I was still searching for. Not justice, not revenge, not even closure, but a place to belong, and a hand to hold without needing to ask. After the court hearing, things didn't explode, they simply unraveled, slowly, quietly, like seams giving way on a well-worn coat. My son stopped speaking to me. He didn't slam doors or leave me with cutting words. He just faded the way someone does when they've lost control and don't know how to exist without it. His wife followed suit. There were no more morning greetings, no more eye contact in the hallway. We became strangers under the same roof, bound only by walls and silence. But the difference now was that the silence belonged to me. I had chosen it, not out of defeat but strength. I didn't explain my decisions, didn't defend my right to peace. I stopped offering soft bridges to people who had long since burned them down. I didn't try to soothe their discomfort. Their discomfort had never spared me. I started spending most of my time in the back garden with Clara. We built a bench beneath the persimmon tree where the light filtered just right in the early evening. She read while I crocheted. Sometimes we didn't speak for hours, but the silence between us was warm. Not the cold absence I used to endure in this house, but a shared quiet, the kind that feels like a hand resting on your back. They moved out 2 weeks after the ruling. No announcement, no fight, just boxes packed hastily and the distant sound of drawers being slammed. My son didn't say goodbye. I watched from the kitchen window as he loaded the last of their things into the back seat and drove off without looking back. I waited for sorrow, for some dull ache, but it never came, only relief. After they left, Clara turned to me. "Are you okay?" I looked around the empty house finally, still finally mine, and I said, "I'm not just okay, I'm free." There were moments in the days that followed where I'd find old things a tie of his, under the bed, her perfume lingering faintly in the bathroom. Ghosts. But I didn't feel haunted. I felt cleansed. I walked through the house without shrinking. I played music in the kitchen. I baked pies for no one in particular, and shared them with neighbors I'd once been too weary to greet. I opened the windows and let the air in, fresh alive. One night, Clara and I sat by candlelight at the dining table. We were sharing a pot of ginger tea. Outside, the wind stirred the trees like waves in slow motion. "You could have yelled," she said suddenly, "months ago. Screamed. Fought them head on. Why didn't you?" I stirred my tea and smiled. "Because silence unsettles people more than shouting ever could," I said. "They expect fury. They prepare for conflict. But when you say nothing, when you simply withdraw, when you walk away without raising your voice, they have nothing to push against. And that's what scares them most." She nodded, quiet as a weapon. "Exactly," I said. but not a weapon to wound, a weapon to protect, to reclaim. She raised her cup to quiet, and I raised mine to choosing peace. It struck me then that all my life I had been afraid of being invisible, but the real fear had never been about fading. It had been about being ignored. There's a difference. One is a choice, the other is a cage. And now for the first time I was free to choose who I let in, to choose what I gave, to choose who I called family. I didn't need to win arguments. I didn't need them to see my worth. I just needed to remember it myself. And so I did. Every morning in the softness of dawn, every evening in the hush of a candle's flame, in the softness of Clara's footsteps, in the way she said Mom without hesitation, in the way my home now held peace instead of tension. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to reclaim my silence. Now the house breathes with me. It no longer creaks with the weight of things unsaid or groans beneath the burden of invisible debts. It exudes calm like a held breath, finally released. In the morning, the light comes through the curtains without hesitation, and I no longer hesitate to meet it. I rise slowly, without urgency, without dread. There is no rush anymore, only rhythm. Clara moves through the home like she was always meant to be here. She hums sometimes in the hallway, a melody I don't recognize, but have grown to love. She calls from the kitchen when she finds a new tea or burns the toast, and I come not because I'm needed, but because I want to. We live like two seasons learning to exist side by side. Her youth brings a gentle warmth to my winter, and I offer her my quiet in return, a peace she says she's never known until now. In the evenings we sit outside and listen to the wind move through the garden like an old story. Sometimes I imagine my husband is there too, watching us from beneath the persimmon tree, smiling that small knowing smile of his. There are no more raised voices, no more slammed doors, just stillness. I didn't get revenge. I didn't scream or throw things or force them to see what they refused to see, but I didn't need to. I chose something better. I chose my dignity. I chose stillness. I chose love, the kind that asks nothing, but offers everything. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. And now in the hush I've made for myself, I have finally found the only sound that matters. Peace.